If God did not place upon him the guilt of your sin and my sin, then we're still stuck in our sin.
Thank you so much for your willingness to take a couple minutes and just talk about this topic. The first question that I had was, could you give us a biblical definition for guilt? And what does the Bible say about guilt? What brings this word up so often in our minds in connection with Scripture?
Sure, it's a great question, and we got to think carefully about it. The key word there is the descriptor biblical. What's the biblical definition? Because the way it's used, words colloquially pick up their meaning by usage. And so the way you hear people talk about guilt is not necessarily the same way we read about it in the Bible. And consequently, the translations that pick up. So a lot of translations might translate it as guilty, or it might translate it as iniquity. So a lot of the English translations that come through as iniquity, we should probably be thinking in terms of the word guilt. A couple of aspects I'll pin down first, and then we'll work on a definition. And that is, guilt is, first of all, if I'm talking about how the Bible presents it, it's objective in nature. It's not subjective. That's a little bit different right out of the box, because when people talk about guilt, they usually talk about guilt feelings. They say, I feel guilty over this. Because the Bible talks about objective guilt, it's almost a courtroom word. And if you've been in a courtroom and the judge has slammed the gavel down and said either guilty or not guilty, then he has rendered a verdict. So the word guilt is objective and is related to a verdict that's been rendered, which is also objective. Now, the thing to keep in mind is that verdict can be either just or unjust. So, for instance, and here's a trick question we give, and that is, was Jesus guilty of sin? Now, you got to be careful in answering that question, because those of us who have a high view of Jesus and believe he was sinless will immediately say, no, he was not personally guilty of sin. That becomes a really, really tricky, because if God did not place upon him the guilt of your sin and my sin, then we're still stuck in our sin.
Yeah.
So he had to be actually really objectively judged as guilty.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, we're stuck. It's about someone who was given a guilty verdict, but didn't commit that crime. Well, that happened to Jesus, right? He certainly wasn't guilty of the crime that they said he was, yet the verdict was rendered, and because the guilty verdict landed on him, his status, the status of Jesus and the status of anybody who gets put into prison for a crime that they were judged guilty of, convicted as being guilty, even if they didn't commit it, their status changes. It's an objective verdict that is rendered by the structure of the society against a person whose status then is related to that judgment. If the judgment says guilty, the status changes with the rest of society. If it's not guilty, then the status, there's still a status recognition with the rest of society.
And just doing a very brief look at how this term is used in other teachings, and one person equated it to anxiety.
Yeah.
And so I'm thinking to myself, that doesn't help me very much if anxiety and guilt are the same thing.
It's the usage of terms is really important, because whatever label we put on something, we're creatures that we like to take the shortest distance between two things. So when we can find out and we can say, well, I think this is this problem, and we put that label on it, now we don't spend any more time on diagnosis. At that point, we're all about how to treat whatever we've labeled. So the label is important because that's now going to change our approach to whatever it is. So if we got the label wrong, then our approach is likely going to be wrong. So we need to make sure that we get the label right.
Yeah.
And what I have found is that when people use the term guilt, they often mean shame.
Okay. Yep.
So
Yep.
shame is the emotion that guilt usually brings, but the two are different. So if someone says, I feel guilty about it, in counseling, then we want to try to find out, well, are you guilty? We got to think in two ways now in terms of guilt. So there is a verdict that can be rendered outside of me by someone else in the structure of society or by God. So if God says I did something wrong and I'm guilty, but our conscience can also judge.
Mm-hmm.
And if our conscience judges something we did as wrong, then we will be guilty. Whether or not there is shame connected with that guilt, which is a judgment, depends upon whether our conscience is hardened or seared or a hardened
Mm-hmm.
heart or not. So the shame is actually helpful. It shows that the conscience is still working and we're sensitive and we can respond to that. Now, so I make that distinction because if someone says they feel guilty and I'm trying to help them with their guilt, then I'm probably not going to be able to help them if what their problem really is about shame, especially if it's if they're making a wrong judgment about their behavior, then I'm not going to be able to help them very far. So the usage of terms is important.